Welcome to Canonical, the podcast that takes literature out of the classroom. I'm James Xiao, and with me, as always, are my guys Friday, Ed Darris, and Sam Spieler.
Hey.
Hey, what does it mean to be a Guy Friday?
Oh, it's Robinson Crusoe. You're my pal.
Is that from Robinson Crusoe?
Collins Dictionary says it's a man who acts as a general assistant. In popular culture, I guess it's Man Friday.
Popular in quotation, I guess. I don't think anybody under the age of 60 is saying this.
But it comes from Robinson Crusoe, so you guys are just ignorant. He meets this native, he calls him Friday, and that guy helps him out. What I'm saying is you guys are my native helpers.
All right. Yeah, we've just been subjugated.
Well, that's fitting, because today we are continuing our discussion of Ko-Eun's The Disaster Tourist, the first book in our series Rich Country, Poor Country. Be forewarned, this discussion may contain spoilers. If you are trying to avoid spoilers, you can listen to our spoiler-free review, which was published last week. If you would like to chat with us, you can find us on social media at CanonicalPod and on Reddit at CanonicalPod.
All right, you guys ready for a bunch of text?
Well, last book, it was history lesson, Sam. Is this lit crit, Sam?
This week it's ecology crit.
Boring.
And whether they bring anything of worth to the table. Professor Christine Marin wrote a book in 2017 called Ecology Without Culture, Aesthetics for a Toxic World. And in it, she writes how cultural ideas, which work at a humanistic scale, usually toward human interest, can impede our ability to speak about the more than human world. And through discussion of various texts about industrial modernity, her materialist approach illustrates how ecocriticism can account for things smaller and greater than a selective humanist we, only if it takes a critical position on cultural exceptionalism. So in other words, ecocriticism based largely from cultural standpoints ignores the elephant in the room supposedly being discussed. That is the natural, non-human world. It's a long book, but I wanted to take some of her concepts and apply them to this book. One of the big ideas she has is the biotrope. She says, cultures have long defined themselves through biological elements to prove their strength and longevity, to make themselves appear as inevitable as the earth itself. This approach to the biological world in narrative fixes it as if in amber for the purposes of making cultural claims. An example of a biotrope that she gives is the amber waves of grain as a lasting impression of the US as this paragon of a nation state. She also mentions how our favorite Haruki Murakami invoked the cherry blossoms of Japan after Fukushima as a cultural beacon of hope and resilience and Japan's mutability, despite Japan's dogged engineering of its islands while resting on this centuries-old imagery. Her point in this concept is to show how, by invoking nature in this way, we actually rob it of agency and force it into cultural support, even at its own ecological expense. So, for example, Murakami's cherry blossoms focus the nuclear fallout as a Japanese issue rather than the global one that it is. It focuses on the people rather than the world that's infecting. So bringing it back to this book, The Disaster Tourist is in part commentary on intercultural problems related to capitalism, commercialism, and tourism, but also a commentary on the ecological disasters related to those things. While the ecological issues are a concern in the book, I feel like they take a back seat to the cultural and anthropocentric issues. Do you see examples of biotropes in The Disaster Tourist? And how are they used?
I'm going to say that this book is probably quite the opposite of what Marin is talking about, because we read about this ecological disaster ennui, and it seems to be treated as something that is only a problem for that nation alone. It is not something that is troublesome to the rest of the world. And that to me seems to be very culture first rather than nature first.
When she says biotrope, essentially is what she's saying that writers, or I don't even know writers, but like, people who create things in culture, that they should not be using these kinds of imagery because it devalues nature and in fact like ignores the natural concern for human problems. Is that what she means?
What I understand her point on biotropes to be is that it kind of forces nature to be on our side, whatever our side is. So, for example, with this cherry blossom idea, we're forcing nature to be a stand-in for our problems and our concerns rather than stand on its own. It takes all of the agency away from nature so that nature becomes just this thing that exists in the world rather than something that needs to be spoken for. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but I don't want to put you on the spot here because I know you didn't write this book. You're not Christine Marin, but I understand it. I understand where she's going with this. My question is like, what is the intrinsic wrong? I know you kind of talk about it, but I'm still confused. Like, what is wrong with this?
I think the problem is that if you are seeking to write eco-criticism by having it pitted in a humanist viewpoint, then we never get beyond doing things for ourselves rather than for the planet.
Yes, that's the way I understand it, is that we see nature as in service to humans and human culture.
Right. So if you apply this to novels that are even like concerned with environment, is she saying that even those novels they fall into this trap where they're using nature in this way?
She says a lot of novels do. A lot of text and film in general does.
This book uses biotropes, so this book is not following this kind of mandate that Marin is offering to avoid them. The clearest example I can see is that she doesn't treat ecological disaster as a global concern. She treats it as a national thing. When there is a disaster on Mui, whatever,
Muy.
Mui, Lucky avoids it just by taking, I guess, a short boat ride over to Ho Chi Minh City. So even though he's very nearby, by being in a different nation, he avoids the problem. So ecological concerns remain very localized and very non-threatening to the rest of the world.
In this book, can you think of any specific biotropes? I'll throw one out there that I thought of. The strangler figs that are presented as these kind of otherworldly things that can crush human structures, but also for some reason show ghostly images of what you're most scared of, I think. They maybe say something to Marin's point about how these trees can withstand and in fact crush most human things. And the same goes for the mangrove forest. But I don't know that they're really doing all that much either way. Like, I feel like they're not really elevating the book to where Marin would want it, but they're also not doing much on the other side either.
I think that the problem with Marin's project, as I see it, is that it divorces fiction from a lot of the things that make fiction attractive to people. It divorces fiction from human beings understanding the natural world on human terms, which I think is the source of a lot of the wonder that people have when they look at the night sky or the ocean. It makes them think of other things. It makes them think of things happening to them. It's very evocative. If we don't think of nature in that way, how do we use nature in a compelling way in fiction?
I think this is part of why she is really into The Man with the Compound Eyes and why we are not. She comes back to that book several times in her book about how that is a good example of what she's looking for, that it is post-human in the way that she's talking about. But in order for it to be so, like you say, it's kind of devoid of a lot of the things that we generally look for in narrative. So, for example, one of the things she says very positively about The Man with the Compound Eyes is that its discussion of the ecological disasters present in that book elevate it beyond a anthropocentric issue to something broader, a worldwide scale. She says, for example, with the image of hundreds of whales beaching themselves in Chile and beating their heads against the sand in pain, this is her quote, the animal biotrope, when it is analyzed at the hypothetical scale, offers a critical ecological perspective because it matters beyond human generational history. So I'm trying to find, is there anything in the eco-criticism of this novel that does elevate its ideas to this post-human ideal? Or is it always kind of stuck in that humanist worldview?
I think if you're asking for this novel or any other novel to be more like The Man with the Compound Eyes, you are going to facing a lot of opposition. It's an uphill battle. Because that novel, like we said in the last episode, it's good to talk about. And when other people talk about it, it's interesting. But actually reading it is not very enjoyable. And I think that where this novel succeeds is in its connection of all of the human elements, the connection of the sexual harassment to the environmental degradation to the anti capitalist point of view. But these are all human points of view. I think that there isn't anything like that, like what we see in The Man with the Compound Eyes in this novel. But for me, it's not a problem.
The only thing I can think of is that storm that occurs, but even then, you kind of have to stretch to say that's an example. Because that storm, when it happens, it actually, like, what, it kind of foils all the human anthropocentric plans, right? It's just variance, it's just something that happens. There is no real relationship between that storm and human planning, or, yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's the closest I can get to it, because people are also not projecting their own ideas onto the storm. She actually makes an effort to not really define the storm. All we know is that it happens, and then things are washed out.
One of the things that bothered me about that storm as a major point in the book is that it feels divine, even though she does foreshadow it a little bit, because we have the earthquake that happened, where was it? In Korea? Was it in Korea? Which I guess also says something about where all the commercialism starts. In this case, it starts with jungle in Korea. So just like that, the storm starts in Korea, but it still feels like this Deus ex machina kind of thing. It still feels like divine intervention ruining everything.
But that's how it has to work, right? Like in Marin's understanding or in her critique, like it has to be like that, because otherwise you're humanizing it, or you're viewing it through an anthropocentric lens.
Right. I guess what I mean is that the way it is depicted in the book feels like the hand of God coming down. I don't think that's what Marin is looking for.
Well, just as a point of clarification, is she calling for nature to be depicted as indifferent to humanity, or is she calling for nature to be depicted in a way that is unrelated to humanity?
I think she's looking for nature to be depicted as working like on equal footing with humanity, so that we are a part of nature rather than using nature for our own benefit. Does that make sense? Like we treat nature as a resource rather than something that we live within.
The reason why I ask is the example that you brought up from The Man with the Compound Eyes with the whales dying in pain. That is something that is unrelated to humanity. Whereas the storm in The Disaster Tourist is indifferent to humanity. But the way that we understand the importance of the storm is because it happens on Mui and it happens to the characters, the human characters that we care about. So there is a distinction I see between them.
I will say that I abbreviated her example quite a bit. That those whales beach themselves because of the nuclear blast that happens at the end of the book. So if you remember, there's the nuclear blast that wipes out this whole unknown island, and it creates a tsunami.
Right, and the whales are the spirits of what is his name, Atile's ancestors or something. But what I mean is that they are animals and they are dying separately from people. I guess what I'm hung up on is like, does it matter if something happens to people? Is something happening just in nature, totally separate from people, really what Marin is calling for? Or is it just for us to look at nature and not worry when we look at it, how does this affect us?
I think you're right that this does go against most of what we call good writing. We've read a lot of good post-human works, but I get the feeling that good post-humanist work that is also ecocritical, especially in the way that she wants, would be pretty hard to do and be worth reading.
I'm almost inclined to say that it's a bit of an experiment to write a novel in this way, where you privilege nature absent from human culture. And it has been done in The Man with the Compound Eyes, but I might say that once is enough. And it doesn't need to be done again because it's an experiment whose scope is so limited that it doesn't need to be repeated.
I think her point, though, is that it does need to be repeated because we keep repeating our same mistakes. If the point of eco-criticism is to change behavior, then it's not working because we're not changing behavior. We are abusing nature in and bending it to serve our goals. Even in the face of ecological disaster, we turn it on ourselves rather than, focus on the nature itself. Before we're completely tired of Christine Marin here, I want to go over another of her ideas. She introduces something she calls ethnic environmentalism. Ethnic environmentalism is attentive to the material world. It has an environmentalist drive, and its ideas are rooted in science. But it works through a presumed collectivity that can be only an illusion for most industrialized capitalist nations. Marin gives an example of a Japanese author claiming that Japan could have avoided some of its problems of modernity if it had stuck to traditional Japanese methods, such as oceanic fish pasturing. This creates this dichotomy of development from within versus imposition from without. It ignores global capitalism and just how powerful modern forces are. It focuses falsely on creating a cultural hierarchy, on sustaining this particular ethnic nationalist collectivity. I'm wondering, do we see examples of this in the book? For example, of Korean thinking over Mui thinking, or vice versa, Mui being better in some way than Korean.
What comes to mind is the tribal conflict on Mui that happens when the initial sinkhole happens and the heads are thrown into the sinkhole. At that time, the tribal differences on the island seem to matter a lot to people. But now, all these years later, the differences between the different tribes are unimportant. The people on the island, when she asks about them, say, oh, it's not important at all. So to me, it's like this idea of the nation state supplanting the tribal identity that people used to have. And in some ways, I think the book positions this as a potentially good thing. This idea from abroad that people can supplant this kind of tribal infighting that they had before. But then on the other hand, I don't know if that's really her point. I think Yun uses this in the book to show that this part of the disaster is something that's just put on for show. It's a very ironic and kind of sarcastic joke that she's making at the expense of the people who go on these trips who want to see disaster and they want to see bloodshed.
I'm trying to make sense of that rising above tribalism only to sink into this haves versus have-nots that Mui devolves into. It feels very similar, except along economical lines rather than birth.
What she's saying here is that ethnic environmentalism, it presumes a collectivity that can only be an illusion for most industrialized capitalist nations. So, what I understand from that is it requires people to think of the world and all of the human beings in the world as their ethnicity. And that can only be an illusion because of what?
Because those are fairly tenuous connections. So in the book, she gives an example of a Tawada story that I have not read, where the character, much like Tawada, goes to Germany, where she's been living, from somewhere else, but it takes place right after, once again, Fukushima. The character has not lived in Japan for like 30 years, has not been to Japan in decades. But once the German officials see that she's from Japan, because of the fallout that's just happened, they are reluctant to touch her passport.
Oh, okay.
Because they're worried about something. And her character at first says, I haven't stepped foot in Japan for 30 years. And after she says that, she feels this deep regret at having sold out her birthplace. When really those borders wouldn't matter, those lines wouldn't matter if there aren't any children of such a nation to exist anymore. In that story, much like in the Tawada book that we read earlier, after Fukushima, or a Fukushima-like event, Japan's children are all dying while the elderly somehow survive. So in that hypothetical world, nation doesn't really matter anymore if you don't have any children to live on afterward. I think Maran uses that example to point to how nations and ethnicity don't really matter if you're just struggling to survive. In the face of ecological disaster, where you're from doesn't really matter.
I think that that might not be really connected to the industrialized capitalist nations. Like, it's not their status as industrialized or capitalist that makes them believe that, I would say. It seems to me that that belief comes from a more central, more human part of our lives. It's not because of the economic system or the development that we have in our countries, but rather just the way people identify naturally.
So, as I mentioned before, I do think there are ecological issues at play here in this book, but they do feel like they take a second fiddle to the rest, to the cultural and humanist values or issues. However, do you think she's saying anything about the ecological issues? Does she have a positive statement?
I think she does. I think she has a ecological concern, but it's not this specific concern that Marin is calling for. The prime example that I think of is the tower that eventually falls in the climax of the novel. And I mean, any sort of a tower is always just kind of a symbol of human hubris, the very phallic symbol to have destroyed by nature. And I think, like a lot of the critical aspects of this book, it's done in a kind of a broad way. I don't think what she is saying specifically matters so much as the fact that she is saying something. She is gesturing towards something. The human world cannot survive the natural world. And that to me is, it's something, but it's not something particularly nuanced or deep.
In the novel, do you think the Mui survive the natural disaster? Because we don't get a lot of details, but my sense is at the end that the Mui are more capable of surviving than the non-Mui people on the island.
Well, the crocodiles survive, right?
Yes, the crocodiles. So I guess one subset of the Mui. These are people who, I guess they're kind of like wanderers. They don't actually live in one place, right?
Yeah, their tax status prevents them from living in a permanent location.
Well, it seems like she's making some kind of comment about, and this is a bit cliched, but this comment about like this more primitive society being able to live alongside nature, and this more, I don't even know if it's a capitalist society, but just this more settled, advanced society being wiped away by nature. And I really hate this reading because it is so cliched, but it seems like that's what's present in the book.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I got from it too.
That's the charitable reading, or that's the optimistic reading. But the way I took it is that the cliche is like after the nuclear fallout, the only thing that will survive are the cockroaches. So, what I'm getting from this novel is that in order to survive a natural disaster, you have to live like cockroaches. And that's why these people are able to survive. So, it's a pessimistic rather than an optimistic note.
Pessimistic, but once again, another thing that I found a hard time believing, that you can survive a tsunami if you just hide in some mangroves. I mean, maybe there's some scientific truth to that. I don't know.
This is not the book that you look to for scientific accuracy, Sam.
What?
The symbolic resonance is meant to be there, whether you choose to accept it or not.
Well, I mean, the message there is the mangrove being a part of nature will shield you from nature, right? Whereas the human built thing will not. But I didn't get the cockroach thing. I don't think living as a crocodile or in mangrove trees are, that's like living like a cockroach.
The reason why they were able to go there is because they weren't fixed to any particular location. They were mobile, they were living on boats.
But that's their lifestyle.
Yeah, but they live that way not because they want to live that way. They live that way because capitalism forces them to.
And the term crocodile, I mean, I don't think she ever explains exactly where the term comes from. She just says that's what we call them. But that implies something unwanted or something less than human.
You get it the same thing like here in Beijing. There are the people who live in the basements called rat people. There's always this underclass that are dehumanized in this way.
My snide comment here is I noticed that we've been talking for 51 minutes and we didn't mention anything from the first half of the book.
Well, it's not an ecological disaster. It's just a normal disaster.
All right, we'll stop here. Thank you for listening. If you disagreed with how we understood this book, if you had a different eco-critical take, you can let us know on social media or on Reddit. We are on social media at Canonical Pod and on Reddit at rcanonicalpod. Also, if you enjoyed this podcast, you can leave us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next week, we'll be back with another in-depth discussion of this book. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.